الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
إن الحمد لله ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله وهو حبيبنا وقدوتنا وإمامنا، فنصلي ونسلم عليه على الدوام ونحن مأمورون على هذا عن طريق القرآن. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم، ونصلي ونسلم على آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين وعلى أصحابه بجهدهم وتضحيتهم قام هذا الدين فرضي الله عنهم أجمعين. In this khutbah, we wanted to focus on 4 promises of Allah wa ta'ala. All 4 are mentioned in the Quran, and 2 of those were mentioned in the Meccan period and 2 were mentioned in the Medinan period. These 4 promises, they caught my attention because of the focus that they have on the heart, and not only on the heart but on our relationship to Allah wa ta'ala. In the first case, we find the ayah that was revealed during the last stage of Mecca, which talks to us about the importance of Shukr. Now, interestingly enough, if we know the history of the life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and the early generation, we know that in the last stage of Mecca, there was intense persecution of the Muslim community. So in this context, Allah wa ta'ala says, لَإِن شَقَرْتُمْ لَأَزِيدَنَّكُمْ. And then the opposite, وَلَئِن كَفَرْتُمْ إِنِّي عَذَابِي لَشَدِيدٌ. The first is that Allah wa ta'ala puts it as a condition that if you are a person of shukr, that you will experience increase. And shukr here is to give thanks to Allah wa ta'ala. And the ulama, they debate on whether there is a difference between giving alhamd or giving shukr. Here I find that the benefit of that debate that benefits us when we think about that context of hardship is that they say shukr is shukr muqabil al-ni'mah. Shukr is given in direct proportion to something that's received. And alhamd, they say, is more general than that. It's for those things received and those things not received. لأن المولى تبارك وتعالى مستحق هو مستحق العبادة. Allah تبارك وتعالى has the right to be worshipped. But here what's important to understand is that in a time of hardship and trial and tribulation, like in that last period of the da'wah, it becomes important to really think about where it is that Allah Ta'ala has given the blessing. It's easy to forget when a person is in hardship, when a person is, as we say, mutadayyik, he's constrained. Mutadayyik al-qalb, his heart is constrained, her heart is constrained. It's easy to become preoccupied in that situation, to be caught up in that, and everything else goes out the door. And many of us, because we're human beings, we know that when we experience the difficulties of life, those difficulties can be overwhelming. And we know in contemporary science, especially in the field of neurology, there's been a lot of progress that has been made in neurology and understanding certain functions of the brain. We know that when a person is under duress, stress, they have a theory about it. We don't have to necessarily agree with the labels, but for the sake of simplicity, they say that there's a part of the brain that is very ancient, similar to the animals. And so that part of the brain, when we go into it, when we're centered on it, in other words, when the chemicals and everything are released because of what we're feeling or thinking or both, then what happens is that we either have a flight response, meaning that we want to run to protect ourselves out of fear, right? Or we freeze. Some of us, we freeze in situations of hardship and stress and so on. Or we fight. Those are the three positions. And that seems to be consistent with the biology of the human being. So I find it interesting, just as a reflection, we're not saying that this is necessarily the exact meaning, but I find it interesting that this ayah is revealed in a time period which is extremely tense. You have to go back and you have to look at the history to understand how tense it was. You're talking about the Muslims being, they're being tortured. There's heavy boycott. And along with that boycott comes the lack of access to basic needs, food, security. You understand what I'm saying? Everything that undermines a sense of stability. And then boom, the Quran comes and talks about the reality of shukr. And if we take that lead from the ulama, it takes some effort from the believer to go in to his or her life and be conscious of where it is that Allah Ta'ala gave you aid. And in that moment, have that relationship to Allah of being thankful for what it is that Allah put in your life and not being preoccupied so much with that which destabilizes your sense of trust in Allah, or your sense of being able to think rationally, or your sense of peace and calmness. Because once you go into that route, then that's where the issue of not being able to intend properly, not being able to think properly. And people, this comes up especially in situations of domestic violence. It comes up in situations where people lose their job. It comes up in thousands of situations. So the issue of shukr here, Allah Ta'ala is giving us that clear understanding. The Quran came in that context. See, when we don't understand the Quran in that context, then we say, oh, Allah is just saying, well, if you're grateful, if you're thankful, then I will increase you. But when we understand the context, we begin to see the wisdom. And we begin to see the wisdom here means how to put something in its proper place. We begin to see how it is that the Quran gives us a deep sense of benefit and how it is that the mercy of Allah manifests itself. Or else what happens is we become disconnected. There's no real way to understand how it is that Allah is working in our hearts, or how to connect with Allah becomes a guessing game. But here, when we look at trial and tragedy and tribulation and in times of plenty, in times of peace and security, and we see how it is that the Quran is speaking to the human being, then we get a roadmap of how to function, a spiritual GPS. The other thing is that Allah Ta'ala tells us, فَاذْكُرُونِي أَذْكُرْكُمْ. وَاشْكُرُوا لِي وَلَا تَكْفُرُوا. Here Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, and this was revealed in the first 2 years of Mecca. It comes in the context of Surah Al-Baqarah, towards the end of Surah Al-Baqarah. Here, the reality of Shukr comes once again, but along with it, the reality of Dhikr. Right? And Dhikr is mentioned before Shukr. To recall Allah, to remember Allah. Right? And then to be from the Shakirin. And last time we met, some weeks back, when we were talking about Surah Al-Insan, there's a part that classified the human beings imma shakir, imma kafur. Either from the person that is a person of shukr, a person of belief and understanding that everything comes from Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. When we say everything, it's hardship and ease. That doesn't cancel out human responsibility. But at the end, who has control? At the end, there's some pains that we suffer and that we experience in life. There's some hardships that we experience in life. It doesn't matter if we go to the most powerful person on the face of the earth. That pain that we experience in our heart cannot be removed. Like the death of a loved one. No matter where you go, what you do, you carry that pain. You go to work, you go to sleep. Especially if you love that person, you're attached to that person. And that's one of those situations that only Allah Ta'ala can release you from that. And it requires a deep amount of patience. That's why it's called the musibah. But death is not the only musibah. And so here the reality of remembering who Allah is and giving shukr comes into play. And Allah Ta'ala is telling us, don't be from those that are ungrateful. Right. So here in the time of Medina, it's a release from what we experience in Mecca. It's almost as to say that when you start to experience some stability, don't become negligent in the remembrance of Allah, and don't become a person, right, that doesn't give shukr to Allah, which will make us from al-kafirin. Here we're talking kafirin here, or kufr is kufr al-ni'mah. Is not to be grateful for the ni'mah of Allah. And the biggest ni'mah of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is the ni'mah of Islam. Is the ni'mah of Islam. And we have to realize that this ayah comes in the context of Surah Al-Baqarah, and what precedes it is the mention that the Prophet ﷺ was sent as a Rasul. أَرْسَلْنَا فِيكُمْ رَسُولًا مِنْكُمْ. That the Rasul was sent as someone from among yourselves. And this ayah in Surah Al-Baqarah, the 151st ayah, is in reality a response to the 129th ayah of Surah Al-Baqarah, in which our father Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam makes dua for a Rasul to be sent, that he's from the people, especially here from the people of the Kaaba. And so this was fulfilled in the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. And the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam, he prayed to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, وَابْعَثْ فِيهِمْ رَسُولًا مِّنْهُمْ يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِكَ. So he asked for a prophet to be commissioned, to be sent, to be tasked with the reality of keeping Tawheed alive and reciting the ayat. And this part is talking about the reality being fulfilled. And then the ayat that comes after, so that's the ayat that comes before. The ayat commanding us to the dhikr of Allah and the shukr of Allah, and not to be of those who take on the quality of kufr. The ayat that comes after says, يا أيها الذين آمنوا استعينوا بالصبر والصلاة إن الله مع الصابرين. So in the first case, we see the Prophet ﷺ as a reminder of who Allah is, teaching us how to remember Allah and how to live in the earth and the nature of reality and so on, how to be a human being. Then we're commanded, what's the ibadah? The ibadah is dhikr and shukr of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. Then the specifics come, because the reality of life is one of hardship. O you who believe, ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, ista'inu bis-sabri was-salah. Seek comfort, seek assistance from Allah. هذا هو العون. Dhikr and shukr is not enough. But seek assistance from Allah. In the issue here, isti'ana, Shaykh al-Tantawi rahmatullahi alayhi, in his tafsir, he mentioned this point. He said, establish the deen. Al-isti'ana here is by establishing the deen. And establishing the deen in detail means that we protect ourselves in our lives by establishing those values that are going to hold up our dignity as human beings. Some of the ulama of tafsir, they said that the whole of the Quran is about the human being. Some people may say, why would you say that? Because if the human being knows who he or she is, then definitely the human being is going to know Allah Ta'ala. There's a saying attributed to the people of suluk in that regard. Some people confuse it for hadith. Those who know themselves don't know Allah Ta'ala. But in other words, the revelation itself comes as a benefit for us to teach us where our benefit is. We mentioned that before. That's a different understanding. Just like Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam prayed for the generations that were to come, and just like Ibrahim laid down the path for the generations were to come, in institutionalizing the deen. Ibrahim struggled to institutionalize the deen. Ibrahim was an immigrant who went into a new reality, a new culture, a new environment, different language, and he established the deen. He didn't lose himself. His son didn't lose himself, Ismail. Ismail, alayhi salatu wasalam, became an imam. And when we say imam, we're not necessarily talking about necessarily an imam in salah. We're talking about a model for humanity. That's the task of the Muslim in this environment. To institutionalize the deen and the values of the deen, not to get lost, but not only preservation of the self. There's the issue of where our children are at. And there's the issue of the generations that are going to come. Some people get confused. So they live in between all of these different worlds. Well, I'm back home, I'm here, I'm there. And when they get confused like that, they lose a sense of direction. And so in the prophets, we have an example. And lastly, we want to mention these 2 points. وَمَا كَانَ اللَّهَ مُعَذِّبَهُمْ وَهُمْ يَسْتَغْفِرُونَ. This ayah hits the heart. It's in Surah Al-Anfal. It was revealed after the battle of Badr. And so the reality here comes in that if the people would seek forgiveness of Allah, Allah is not seeking to punish, but Allah sent the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam as rahmah. That's the confusion sometimes that we have with regard to how we deal with life. There has to be a limit to our injustice as human beings. It just can't continue forever and ever. There has to be a limit. There has to be some boundaries. There has to be values that are established. And so in the situation of Badr, the believers were forced into that situation. That's not how the da'wah began. Those who understand the history of the da'wah. But the thing that hits home here is that if we feel as though Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is punishing us, and we say, why? Why is Allah doing this to me? What did I do? We hear that in this age. There was an age where maybe we didn't hear that language. But the human experience in this age is that you hear from the Christians, you hear from the Muslims, you hear from those who don't claim any religion, but they claim to believe in spirituality. You hear that everywhere. But here the Quran is teaching us, if we want to preserve ourselves, then seek the forgiveness of Allah. Because the context here is those who don't want to seek the forgiveness of Allah, وَيَسْتَكْبِرُونَ. They become the people of kibr. They become the people of arrogance. They become the people of pride. Like we don't have any issues that we have to turn to Allah and ask for forgiveness for. That type of concept. Like me, I'm on the earth and everything on the earth is only here to serve me as I will. And I have nothing in service that is to be given in return. Yes, the human being has a high station on the earth. But the reality of the human being is that نحن عباد الله. We have a relationship with Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, which is one of accountability. And we find our purpose and our meaning and sense of peace and sense of real stability when we have that relationship with Allah. Because the nature of the dunya is ever changing. There's no stability in the dunya for us as human beings. Even in our bodies, we don't have stability. What we knew of ourselves 15 years ago is not what we know of ourselves now. And as we age, we even feel the frailty. We come from frailty as being babies and we go back to frailty. And so that's why the issue of kibr or the issue of arrogance doesn't make any sense. And so seeking that forgiveness of Allah. The first, the shukr of Allah. Then the dhikr and reminder of the shukr of Allah. And then seeking the forgiveness of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. And lastly, the Quran teaches us that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala commands. وَقَالَ رَبُّكُمْ. Even the use of the word Rabb. Why didn't Allah use the word Allah or Ar-Rahman? Rabb here is the one that created us and takes care of us and sustains us, wants good for us, desires good for us. Right? We have to be sensitive to those meanings. قَالَ رَبُّكُمْ ادْعُونِي يَسْتَجِبْ لَكُمْ. Call unto Allah in dua so that Allah can respond. And these four promises of Allah are promises which have everything to do with where we're at in our hearts and where we're at in our relationship with Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, where we're at with ourselves, and how it is that we see the world. Many of us are hurting, are in pain, are struggling, and there won't be any way to address that until we realize that we have to turn to Allah in this reality. Where that pain and that struggle is a very personal journey. These are emissaries of Allah. The pains, the struggles. Emissaries of Allah to guide us to the way, to show us that this dunya is temporary. That doesn't mean that the dunya doesn't have meaning. That doesn't mean that we don't have responsibility on earth. That doesn't mean that we just become otherworldly and we forget the nature of this world. That's not the example of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But the nature of the dunya is that which it is temporary, it's fleeting. It will disappoint us. The people will disappoint us. What we expected in life may not come to us. We may feel betrayal. We may feel depression, hardship. Those are all emissaries. At the end of the day, where do we turn? Are we going to turn solely to the pill? Are we going to solely turn to the TV shows? Are we going to turn to materialism? Just accumulate as much wealth as possible? Not that there's good. We're not denying that there's good in those things with their proper limitations. But at the end, what will satisfy the heart is only Allah. And so that's why we end the last promise being that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala calls us to make dua, to cry out to Allah. How many of us we have forgotten this reality, except in a time of deep hardship? And so we ask Allah Ta'ala to forgive us and to aid us and to guide us and to facilitate for us. And we ask Allah Ta'ala to descend this sakina upon us. And we ask for Allah Ta'ala's forgiveness and protection and His comfort. And we ask Allah Ta'ala to guide us and to guide our families and our children. And we ask Allah Ta'ala for an increase in iman and an increase in wealth. And we ask Allah Ta'ala to allow us to see Ramadan and experience Ramadan and get the forgiveness of Ramadan and to be companions of the Quran. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم وبارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. And so we end this khutbah with reminding ourselves on the importance of shukr, being grateful to Allah Ta'ala, and the importance of dhikr, and the importance of istighfar or tauba overall. There's no sin that's not forgiven by Allah Ta'ala, and that's why the gates of tauba are always open. And lastly, the benefit of dua. When there's no one to cry to, always remember that there is Allah Ta'ala who is Sami'a al-Basir, the all-hearing, and the one that has all insight and sees all things. And Allah Ta'ala promised us in the Quran to respond, but it requires from us some patience. Protect yourselves, O believers, with the salah, and protect yourselves with the dhikr of Allah Ta'ala. We ask Allah Ta'ala for those who are sick among us. We ask Allah Ta'ala for those who are very sick among us in the hospital in difficult conditions, and we ask for their families. And we ask Allah Ta'ala for those that are without employment. And we ask Allah Ta'ala for those that are having hardship in their families. And we ask Allah Ta'ala for those who have died and have preceded us, that they be counted from among the people of Jannah and their sins be forgiven, and whatever bad deeds that they have be turned into good deeds. And we ask Allah Ta'ala for the poor all over the earth, those without food, those without water, those without shelter. And we ask Allah Ta'ala for the guidance of this country and for stability and the stability of other countries as well. And we ask Allah Ta'ala for the protection of those who are most vulnerable. For those who are incarcerated, we ask for their release. And we ask Allah Ta'ala for those that are lonely, that they be accompanied by you, Allah Ta'ala. And we ask Allah Ta'ala, we ask you to die in the state of Islam.